I'm speaking into the recorder because paper feels too slow for what happened, and because the station archive protocols require an unbroken narrative if an incident involved a fatality or unexplained environmental hazards, both of which now apply. My name isn't important for the record. What matters is that I was assigned to investigate a series of unusual outages along the state's northern broadcast corridor, a stretch of weather-beaten relay towers that were supposed to be decommissioned years ago, but kept flickering back to life on emergency frequencies, transmitting something that engineers only described as non-conforming audio. That's the term they use when the system picks up sound it isn't supposed to carry. Fragments of voices with no origin point, interference patterns shaped like speech but with no human signature. I drove out 2 nights ago alone because the outlet I write for doesn't have the kind of budget that covers field crews, and because I've always believed stories are clearest when no one else is around to contaminate the observations. The highway was empty except for the wind dragging dust across the asphalt. Navigation kept glitching, rerouting me toward the hills even after I tried to ignore it. I wouldn't mention that in a report normally, but it matters now because the same thing happened to the last technician who came out here before disappearing for 12 hours and returning with no memory of where he'd been. I reached Tower 16 at 1:27. The structure rose out of the dark like a rusted spine, lights dead except for a single blinking red beacon near the top that shouldn't have had power. The air hummed, faint but deliberate, like something alive was pressed against the metal. I walked the perimeter and found service panel be open, wires exposed, frost lining the edges even though the night was warm. My recorder picked up static every time I stepped closer, bursts of it that flattened out into something almost like breathing. The first real indication that this wasn't a simple equipment malfunction came when I noticed the footprints. One set, bare, leading from the gravel access road directly to the tower's maintenance ladder. No other tracks around them. No vehicle marks. No dust displaced except where the prints had sunk deep enough to expose moist earth beneath. I followed them with my flashlight, slow, steady, trying not to make assumptions, but the spacing was wrong. Too even, too precise. Each print identical in depth and shape. Toe marks sharp, as if whatever made them weighed more than a normal person, but moved without staggering. I tried radio contact with dispatch. Only static came back, shaped strangely, rising and falling as if responding to my voice. I said my name again, my location, but the static only grew louder, compressing into a single high tone that felt like it drilled behind my eyes. I turned off the radio after that. At the base of the ladder, the final footprint pointed upward, heel lifted as if the person or thing had stepped onto the first rung. The metal there was warm. Not from the sun, not at this hour. Warm like a hand had just pressed against it. I climbed 6 rungs before the vibration through the structure intensified, so suddenly I nearly lost my grip. The beacon light above flickered, then steadied, then flickered again in a pattern I recognized from a briefing I'd read earlier in the week. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. An emergency identifier code used by field technicians when they're in distress. But no technician had been deployed tonight. I started recording again because my notes were shaking too much to trust. When I reached the midpoint platform, the air smelled metallic, almost burnt. I could hear something faint through the tower's frame. Not a voice exactly, but the cadence of someone trying to speak through a damaged transmitter. I leaned closer to the metal paneling, and the sound sharpened for a moment. A single phrase emerging through the distortion. Do not look down. I froze. The voice hadn't come from my radio. It had come from the tower itself, traveling through the steel like bone conduction. I didn't obey right away. I wish I had. My flashlight slid from my hand, beams spinning as it fell, and in that brief sweep of light across the ground far below, I saw another set of footprints. Fresh ones, forming in the dirt as if pressed there by something invisible, each one appearing in a slow, deliberate step, moving toward the base of the tower, moving toward me. The recorder vibrated in my hand. The voice came again, clearer this time, and it wasn't a warning anymore. It was an instruction: keep climbing. I kept climbing because every instinct I had was firing in conflict. The rational part of me insisting I should retreat, file a report, bring a team. The older, quieter part, the one that made me a journalist in the first place, pushing me upward, telling me that whatever was happening here wouldn't wait for bureaucracy to catch up. The beams rattled beneath my hands, not from wind, but from a low rhythmic pulse traveling through the structure. It reminded me of a generator struggling to start, except there was no power supply connected to Tower 16 anymore. Every step felt like I was getting closer, not to a source, but to an intention. At the next platform, I found the technician's bag. It was zipped shut, undamaged, resting neatly against the railing as if someone had placed it there for me. I checked the ID badge on the side pocket. Lewis Grant, Senior Maintenance Operations. Missing 36 hours. The interior was dry despite the frost on the metal. Inside were standard tools, a portable spectrum analyzer, and his personal recorder. It was dead, battery drained, no signs of damage. But when I shook it slightly, I could hear something loose rattling inside the casing, like a fragment of glass or ceramic. I didn't open it. Something told me it was better not to. The moment I lifted the bag, the platform vibrated with a sudden sharp intensity, like the tower was reacting to the change in weight. The beacon above dimmed for a second, and the static from below rose again, forming shapes of sound that almost resembled words. I felt watched, not from the ground now, but from somewhere much closer. The metal behind me warmed, a slow spreading heat that pressed through my jacket. I turned, expecting to see someone climbing up after me, but the ladder was empty all the way down, vanishing into darkness. The footprints on the ground were gone, swept clean or never truly there. I don't know which possibility is worse. I resumed climbing, faster this time, the bag slung over my shoulder. Halfway to the top platform, the tower emitted a deep, resonant groan that felt like an exhale. The radio on my belt clicked twice, completely dead moments earlier, and then a voice burst through, warped and distant, like someone shouting from underwater. Not words at first, just the shape of panic. Then, slowly, as if struggling through layers of interference, don't trust the height. I didn't understand what that meant until the next rung bent under my foot slightly, not from my weight, but from the pulse moving through the metal. The entire tower seemed to shift, but not in any direction I recognized, as if the structure's orientation was no longer aligned with the ground beneath it. The stars had changed position, only by inches, but enough that I felt a disorienting pull behind my eyes. I kept my breathing steady and didn't look away from the ladder. When I reached the top platform, the air was different, thinner, colder, and carrying a faint electrical taste. The beacon light here flickered softly, steady enough to see by, but dim enough that everything felt submerged in a red haze. The center panel, an access hatch to the old transmitter, was open, and kneeling beside it, half inside the cavity, was a figure. I only saw the back at first, clothes torn and stiff with frost, shoulders shaking slightly like they were trying to breathe in rhythm with the tower's pulse. I whispered the technician's name, but the figure didn't react. I stepped closer, slowly, each footfall causing a ripple through the platform. Only when I was an arm's length away did the figure stop moving. Not in recognition, in perfect stillness, as if the motion had been switched off. A cold draft rose from the hatch, carrying with it a faint whispering static. I knelt beside the figure and gently turned it by the shoulder. The face was pale, eyes open, not seeing me but fixed on something far beyond. Lips parted slightly, as if caught mid-sentence. Frost traced the edges of the eyelids, the mouth, the nostrils. His body was warm. Too warm. Warmer than my own hands. It was like the heat I'd felt through the ladder had been radiating through him. Before I could check a pulse, the recorder in his pocket clicked on by itself. A distorted voice played, a single looping phrase that rose and fell with unnatural clarity. "It's not the tower." The platform shuddered with a violent jolt, and somewhere deep within the metal frame, I heard another voice answer. Not transmitted, not electronic. Close. Behind me. Look again. I didn't turn around right away because the voice didn't feel like something spoken into the air. It felt like it was placed directly behind my thoughts, as if whoever or whatever said it already knew the exact moment I would react. The platform trembled with a slow circular motion, not shaking but rotating, a subtle shift that made the horizon tilt just a few degrees. The stars above bent slightly, like they were being pulled along with the movement. I finally turned, slowly, bracing myself, but there was no one on the platform except me and the technician's body. The ladder below was empty, and the beacon cast a weak red cone that disappeared into the dark. But the air directly behind me was warmer, like someone had been standing close enough to touch the back of my neck. I remained still and let the recorder capture the silence. The tower pulsed again, one long vibration, then two short ones, like a coded sequence. I crouched near the hatch and leaned closer to the technician's face, hoping for any sign of life, but his eyes didn't track, didn't blink, didn't even hold the glassy look of death. They were focused on something that wasn't there, something above or beyond. The warmth coming off his body intensified for a moment, a heat so strong I had to pull back. Something shifted inside the transmitter cavity, a scraping metallic sound like a cable tightening. When I angled my flashlight into the hatch, I saw that the internal wiring had been rearranged, not cut or frayed, but woven, braided tightly around the central conduit. It looked intentional, purposeful, like hands had done it. Dozens of hands. I took a slow breath and reached toward the conduit, trying to get a closer look, but the moment my fingers brushed the metal, the recorder I was holding crackled violently with a surge of static. The static compressed into rhythmic pulses matching the tower's vibration. I froze as the pulses shaped themselves into a distorted voice, one that sounded close, too close, like it was speaking from inside my own jaw. He climbed higher. I whispered into the recorder, asking who he was, but the static didn't respond. Instead, a deep groan echoed from below the platform, the kind of sound a massive structure makes when it's under stress, but it didn't feel like stress. It felt like motion. Slow, deliberate motion. The tower wasn't swaying. It was straightening, lengthening. I know how impossible that sounds, but the angle of the horizon shifted again. The stars stretched slightly, like I was being pulled somewhere that wasn't vertically up or down, but a direction I didn't have a name for. The warmth behind me intensified suddenly, radiating through my jacket. Instinctively, I stepped away from the hatch and turned toward the far railing. That's when I saw the second set of footprints. They formed on the metal grating of the platform itself, one after another, the weight pressing down enough to bend the frost crystals around each step. They approached the body, paused, then turned toward me. I backed up until I hit the railing. The recorder thumped against my chest with each heartbeat. The footprints stopped about 3 feet in front of me. Then the metal under them dented slightly, as if something was shifting its weight, tilting its head, observing. The air between us shimmered like heat haze, even though the temperature had dropped to a raw chill. A faint breath, cold, deliberate, pushed against my face. It wasn't human breathing. Too slow, too steady, too controlled. The technician's recorder, still in his pocket, clicked again. This time the voice coming through wasn't distorted. It was calm, almost conversational. "You're not at the top." The platform beneath my feet lurched downward, not falling, not breaking, just dropping a few inches as though a new section of tower had extended above us, pushing the platform lower in the structure. I looked up instinctively, and the sight made my stomach twist. There were more rungs above me now. A new length of ladder, stretching upward into darkness, where moments ago there had only been the beacon. The tower had grown, or it had revealed more of itself. The warmth behind me vanished instantly, replaced by a cold so sharp it felt like it cut through the air. The footprints in front of me shifted, turning toward the new ladder segment. Then, slowly, they ascended, each step pressing into metal that groaned quietly beneath invisible weight. I stood still, frozen by a mixture of terror and absolute fascination, watching the footprints climb higher and higher until they disappeared into the dark. I don't know why I followed. Curiosity, duty, something else. Maybe the tower was counting on that. I grabbed the technician's recorder, slung the bag tighter over my shoulder, and stepped onto the newly formed rung. The metal was warm again, almost welcoming. The voice from the recorder whispered one last phrase before the static swallowed it. He waited at the real summit. I kept climbing. I didn't turn right away. Every instinct told me that whatever stood behind me wasn't shaped for light, wasn't meant to be viewed directly, and that giving it attention would be an invitation rather than a reaction. The tower's pulse slowed, each vibration stretching longer, deeper, like the structure was inhaling in preparation. I kept my eyes on Lewis, on the unnatural warmth of his skin, on the faint rise and fall of his chest that didn't match any human rhythm. When I finally forced myself to look over my shoulder, I didn't see a figure, only a distortion in the red-stained air, a slight warping of the space near the ladder, as if heat rose from a surface that wasn't there. I blinked once, and the distortion tightened, pulling itself into a narrower shape, not solid but outlined by static, like the visual equivalent of a detuned frequency. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It simply existed in a place it shouldn't, waiting with a patience that felt older than the tower, older than anything built by human hands. Lewis exhaled suddenly, a quiet rasp, and his eyes shifted, not toward me, but toward the distortion. He wasn't conscious. His pupils were dilated, unresponsive, but his gaze followed that impossible shape with the slow magnetism of someone listening to a whispered order. The recorder in his pocket clicked again, climbed down. The distortion pulsed in sync with the tower. A warning? A command? I didn't know. I backed toward the open hatch, its interior descending into darkness thick as tar. The air rising from it carried no scent, only a feeling, an impression of depth far greater than the physical size of the transmitter cavity. I shone my light inside, and the beam vanished quickly, swallowed not by shadow, but by something that refused to reflect it. I stayed on the platform because every option felt wrong, and the human mind chooses the wrongness that feels most familiar. The distortion shifted, stretching slightly upward as if trying to align with the beacon's dim, red glow. The metal beneath my feet flexed with a soft groan, followed by a second one deeper in the tower, then a third, forming a pattern, a rhythm, not random metal strain. My recorder vibrated in my palm as the static condensed into a new message. You're not at the top. The instinct to look down was overwhelming. I resisted for several seconds before the pressure in my skull made resistance feel impossible. When I finally glanced over the platform's edge, the ground wasn't where it should have been. The desert floor was there, far below, but it wavered, rippling like a reflection in disturbed water. And beneath that shimmering surface, deeper than the night itself, I saw the tower continuing downward. Another structure, perfectly mirroring the one I stood on, extending beneath the earth as if the metal skeleton had grown roots, descending into darkness without end. The footprints I'd seen earlier weren't on the surface anymore. They were moving along the mirrored tower below, stepping upward, approaching my position from beneath. My breath caught. The distortion behind me contracted abruptly, snapping into a clearer outline. A tall, narrow silhouette with angles too sharp and proportions slightly off, like a human figure reconstructed from memory by something that had never seen one up close. The silhouette lifted its head, or the approximation of one, and the red light refracted strangely around it, bending in ways that made the air ripple. Lewis's body jerked once, violently, as if an invisible cord had tightened around his spine. His mouth opened wider than before, and a thin trail of static leaked out, rising like vapor, merging with the silhouette's form. My instincts finally aligned with the truth. This wasn't an entity living inside the tower. This was something the tower had been built around, a shape the metal had grown to contain rather than control, and now the containment was failing. The footprints beneath the surface quickened. The mirrored structure trembled, and the silhouette stepped closer, its edges vibrating in and out of existence as though synchronizing with my heartbeat. My recorder crackled again, this time with a fractured chorus of Lewis's voice, the technician before him, and one I didn't recognize layered beneath them. If you stay still, it will choose for you.